Deputy President Paul Mashatile says all the proposals to reform and stabilise coalitions will be considered. Mashatile delivered the closing remarks at the two-day national dialogue on coalition governments. Yesterday, political parties expressed concerns about coalition instabilities in local government. The National Freedom Party warned that unless politics is separated from administration, coalition governments will not work. However, the African Christian Democratic Party suggested that legislation to maintain law and order. All parties agreed that the main goal is to serve in the interests of South Africans. Well, for more on this, we're now joined by Ebrahim Fakir, a senior research associate at the Center for African Diplomacy and Leadership at the University of Johannesburg and director of AWOL Socio-Economic Research Institute. Ebrahim, appreciate your time this evening. Now, what is the purpose of the National Dialogue on Coalition Governments, and how does it aim to address the challenges and complexities of coalition politics in South Africa?
Well, I mean, look, I imagine the intention of the Deputy President was to convene a range of different stakeholders to talk about how best they could sort of attend to the question of stabilizing coalition government. Because it's important for us to differentiate coalition politics from coalition government, right? So coalition politics is when the parties come together in wanting to pursue power and attain it. And coalition government is about what do they do once they attain that power? How do they administer it? How do they implement it and so on? And we've seen in municipalities that there's major instability because you have small parties which try to leverage gains from bigger parties. They destabilize things. There's constant shifts and changes and so on. And so I imagine that government wanted to think about how to stabilize the situation, firstly, by introducing a set of rules. And secondly, to ensure that what's happened at local government doesn't happen at national and provincial government, should there be a need after the 2024 elections for coalitions. Now, the problem here is that it's been billed as a dialogue. And process-wise, if it's a dialogue, surely you should first take people's views, ideas, perceptions, comments, criticisms, opinions, and what have you. And only after that would you develop a draft bill. So I'm frankly surprised that the dialogue only ended today, I imagine, and already they're talking about a draft bill. And it seems to me from news reports that the Deputy Minister for Cooperative Government appears to confirm that there is a draft bill in existence. Now, that seems a bit extraordinary. Why would you have a draft bill if you haven't yet concluded the dialogue? Well, it doesn't make sense.
Well, Ebrahim, allow me to ask you that question. Why would you have that draft bill?
Well, clearly, it seems as if they, the governing party, which we all know is the ANC, is the party in government, they are going to claim that as a responsible party, they would be responsible in kind of mitigating the risks and coming up with proposals and plans to mitigate the risks. That is all well and good. That is, in fact, commendable. But surely, as a process, why, if you're doing something commendable of that in that nature, why don't you let the process run out? How do you at the conclusion of a dialogue already have or talk about the contents of a draft? Well, what you should be talking about and debating at this stage is the different kinds of proposals, whether, you want a minimum threshold for parties to achieve before they can hold executive office, whether the party with the largest share of votes in a pure proportional representation has the first option to form a government with partners and so on. So those are the kind of rules, those are the kind of proposals you would debate. You wouldn't ordinarily say, we're suddenly going to codify this into a draft bill. That's a bit unusual. And so if you take that unusual nature of it would seem to suggest that this is a governing party which is trying to use its position and leverage its position as a leader on government to set itself up in pole position to craft rules which are advantageous to it, let's put it that way.
So do we read into the many conversations that people are having in South Africa at the moment that the ANC, for all intents and purposes, is going to fall way below 50%? in next year's election, and that if indeed it is, and this is something that the ANC has sat down and talked about, that this issue around this bill, which, as you've suggested, is already almost complete, is part of that process, that we are going to be in a coalition government of sorts next year. So let's prepare for the worst.
Yes and no. I mean, look, let's not get into this business that they're definitely going to fall below 50%. Who knows? Because if everyone definitively know, why on earth do we have elections? Let's have the election. We don't know. And opinion polls, so far as they go, seem to suggest that the ANC is going to fall below 50%. Well, if the opinion polls are so accurate, then, once again, why do we need to have the election?
Well, Ebrahim, I don't know if it's rhetorical, but if you'd like me to answer that question, that you plan for a scenario, for any scenario. If you're a government, if you're any political party, you're going to the election, you don't know for a fact what's going to happen. So what do? Is you plan. You plan, okay, if we fall below 50%, this will safeguard our interests. If we're not at below 50%, then we don't necessarily have to make use of the bill.
Yes, well, I mean, that's precisely what I'm talking about when I say they're trying to put themselves into pole position and to mitigate the fallout of the risks. But the point I'm trying to make to you is let's not fall into assumptions about what the results are going to look like. The reality of the matter is whether the ANC achieves a 50% threshold and majority next election or not. The reality is that coalitions are with us, and they have been with us since 2016. Now, whether they will be with us at national government, who knows? It certainly appears as if it might be true for two provinces at the least. And even if we discount those two provinces, there's still coalition governments in the major metropolitan areas, which actually account for about 40% of the population. So 40% of the population is currently being governed by coalitions which are terribly unstable. So you do need a stabilizing mechanism, right? I don't think anyone is arguing that shouldn't happen. What the opposition parties and others are questioning is why does a governing party pretend as if it is having a conversation with everyone else to devise appropriate rules which are fair, which are inclusive, which are representative, and which are proportionate to the situation. Why would you then come up with or already suggest that there's a draft bill? That's problem number one. Problem number two is the opposition parties who are making a big noise about the fact that they don't want thresholds at all haven't really engaged in the discussion properly, because you can get thresholds of two sorts. First is you can have a threshold which says if you don't meet this threshold, you can't be in a representative institution, that is a parliament, a provincial legislature, or a council. I don't think anyone is suggesting that threshold must be applied. The threshold that people are talking about is that you must achieve a certain amount of popular support in order to hold executive office. That means in cabinet, in the mayoral committee, or a provincial executive. That sounds to me more prudent. And if that's the case, then the smaller opposition parties can't have it all ways. Either you want some stability in government, or you want the case of the tail wagging the dog, where small parties can, in games of brinkmanship and opportunism and hypocrisy, kind of either lend their support to form a government or withdraw it, thereby creating instability. You can't have it both ways. But let's just be clear. I don't think anyone, and we should not argue, that a threshold should be allowed for representation. I think all parties should be represented, provided they qualified to get that seat. But whether they should be represented in government, that means should they have a right to form government, there a threshold is entirely appropriate, because that threshold will say, listen, you do command a constituency, a sizable constituency of support in society, therefore you should govern.
Now, we've had numerous challenges with coalition governments in the last few months. What lessons have we learned that would be mitigated, if you will, by this bill, if it is passed?
Not many. And the simple reality is that we in society have learned many of the lessons. There are many regulatory instruments that can be used. The threshold's been one. Second, the idea that the party which has the largest share of votes be given the first option. Third, you increase the amount of time available by which you can negotiate and form a government. Fourth, that the distribution of executive portfolios are proportionate in relation to the kind of support that you command. So there, just off the top of our heads, we can discuss. We've picked up 4 prudent rules that could be implemented. Look, if you overregulate, you have a tendency to bureaucratize politics. We don't want that on the other hand either. We want parties to be free enough to negotiate, to come up with credible partners, and so on. What we don't have is a level of 2 things. We don't have a level of maturity amongst our parties. And secondly, the most fundamental thing we're lacking is a fidelity to respect agreements that you make and respect the institutional rules of the game. And until you have that, you can have a state-of-the-art regulatory and legislative framework. It simply won't work because parties are not interested in respecting the rules of the game.
Now, how can written agreements between coalition partners enhance transparency and accountability within coalition governments?
It can because, there's a published document. They both signed up to it. The public can see that, hey, this one broke the agreement, that one didn't break the agreement. You can hold them accountable in the sense that you might not vote for them in the next election because you can see who the clear transgressor of these agreements are. But we've seen that happen already. Parties which are bitter enemies, simply for the sake of power, come together. Now, unless those agreements are legally enforceable, all you have is moral persuasion or moral suasion and the threat of not electing them the next time round. One of the downsides about these things is that you're then saying, listen, here's an agreement. We force you to work together, and even if you can't work together, then you have the unintended consequences of stonewalling, of obstructionism, of just simple recalcitrance, like I just don't want to cooperate. And we've seen enough of that as well. So whatever regulatory instrument you choose, there has to be the basic sense that there's a fidelity first to the rules and secondly a fidelity to agreements. In the absence of that, like I said, you can have what you want, you can throw what you want at the situation, it simply won't work because of the level of immaturity.
Ebrahim Fakir is a Senior Research Associate at the Center for African Diplomacy and Leadership at the University of Johannesburg. Appreciate your time this evening.